Hello, and welcome again to We the Podcast, where we examine today's issues through the lens of the United States Constitution, breaking down its structure, its original intent, and how our founding fathers designed our government to function. Because in our constitutional republic, the final safeguard of liberty is not a president or a court, but an informed and engaged citizenry. Last week, we spoke about the national popular vote movement and how the broader question of whether we are preserving the constitutional structure of this republic is slowly reshaping it into the name of democracy and fairness. That conversation wasn't really about elections, it was about the structure. It was about whether the constitutional design still matters. Tonight, we are going to be turning to another pressure point, and that pressure point is war powers. Over the past couple of weeks, the United States has increased its military presence in the Middle East. Naval assets are positioned, deadlines have been issued. Escalation with Iran is no longer hypothetical, it's openly being discussed. So the question tonight is not simply whether military action is justified. The question is who decides? Who holds the authority to initiate hostilities? What does the Constitution actually say? And how does the War Powers Resolution fit into modern conflicts? If you want the deepest dive we've done on the founder's intent and the War Powers Resolution, go back to episode 1. Tonight, we will build on that foundation and apply it to the current moment. If something in this discussion clarifies your thinking or raises a question, let us know in the comments. Thoughtful engagement is always welcome here. So let's begin. Right now, the United States is assembling real operational capability in and around the Middle East. Carrier strike groups, long-ranged aircraft, missile defense assets, refueling and logistics that only matter if sustained operations are on the table. That is not a press release. That is a show of force. When major assets move into position, it changes the decision environment. It creates options. It creates pressure. Those in themselves are not necessarily bad things, but it also creates momentum. If you want a modern comparison that people understand immediately, think about Russia's buildup along the Ukrainian border before the invasion. Not because the situations are identical, but because a large-scale military posture signals preparation for something that could last, not a quick one-day operation. In the early 2000s, before the Iraq invasion, the United States staged forces, assembled regional capability, widened logistics, and tightened the diplomatic corridor. That buildup didn't guarantee war, but it was the preparation for it's what preparation for war looks like. Trump also had issued a deadline, a countdown paired with the capability. Now layered into that posture, the president's deadline. President Trump has publicly stated that Iran has a limited window, roughly 10 to 15 days, to reach what he calls a meaningful agreement. He has framed it as a choice: deal or really bad things happen. And importantly, he has linked that deadline to the military posture. A deadline without capability is just political messaging. A deadline with a carrier group behind it is leverage. And it has a countdown attached to that force. At the same time, diplomacy has been moving in parallel. Indirect engagements have occurred. Intermediaries have carried proposals. Iran has signaled that it may submit to terms in writing even as the scope of the United States demands widens beyond the nuclear file. So you have diplomacy running alongside deployment. That can stabilize a crisis. If it leads to resolution, good. But if it destabilizes it, it becomes a corridor for escalation. Iran's posture and the risk of spillover, for its part, has issued warnings about retaliation. Iran is saying that if we attack them, they will attack back. The message is consistent. If the United States bases and assets in the region could become targets, then any attack against Iran could be a problem. Now, yes, much of Iran's posturing is theatrical. Their conventional capabilities are not comparable to our own. But that is exactly why the constitutional structure matters. If a president can unilaterally decide to strike, escalate, and negotiate while Congress reacts afterwards, then we have drifted toward a king-like model of foreign policy. Representatives become decorative. The people lose their voice at the decision point that matters the most. And here's the point that should sober everyone. Swap Iran with Russia. Swap Iran with China. In those scenarios, a cycle of posture, deadlines, strike, and retaliation can drag the country into a serious long-term conflict that cannot simply be walked back. This is why the Constitution placed the authority to initiate war and major hostilities in Congress. And we'll dive deeper on that later. Earlier, I had mentioned Iraq. I want to draw that comparison directly because it helps people understand what we are watching. In the Iraq era, the United States assembled regional capability, tightened deadlines, and narrowed diplomatic windows, and moved the machinery into place. And in 2002 to 2003, Congress debated and ultimately passed an authorization for the use of military force. There was a vote. Members went on record. The country crossed the threshold into war through a formal legislative act. However controversial that decision became, it still followed constitutional procedure. That sequence matters because in more recent years, we have watched it flip. We have watched major uses of force happen first, and then congressional deliberation follow later. And once hostilities begin, Congress is no longer deciding whether the nation should enter conflict. It is responding to the reality already created. That is why Iraq remains a strong reference point, because it was the last time Americans clearly saw the country cross into sustained war through prior legislative authorization. So if you rewind to recent executive uses of force without prior authorization, you must understand why this current buildup feels so heavy. Why it feels less like routine positioning and more like the edge of something larger. So we have to rewind. Because what's driving anxiety for many on this topic is not just the shifts, not just the deadline, not just the rhetoric, it's the pattern. A pattern where force is initiated first and constitutional debate second. In Iran, on June 21st, the United States conducted coordinated strikes against the Iranian nuclear facilities, joining Israel's broader military campaign. And these were not just symbolic targets. They were hardened, strategical, significant sites. Striking them would require intelligence, preparation, precision munitions, airspace coordination, force protection, and executive authorization at the highest levels. The administration argued that the strikes were necessary to prevent nuclear advancement and reinforce deterrence. And if you circle back to Iraq again, we had the same argument made about WMDs with Saddam Hussein. Now, I'm not saying that just because the WMDs were not there, there's no argument to go in. Saddam Hussein was a monster. He was a monster in many ways. But that's going down a rabbit hole that I'm going to avoid for tonight. The administration also argued that the strikes were necessary as a deterrence. That may be the strategic case, but the constitutional question runs on a different track record. Even if an action is necessary, even if it is tactically or strategically brilliant, the Constitution does not assign one person the authority to decide when the nation crosses into hostilities. That decision belongs to Congress. The president's discretion begins after authorization in how to execute the mission as commander-in-chief. Here, the strike occurred first and debate followed. Then there was Venezuela. On January 3rd of this year, U.S. forces executed an operation in Caracas, resulting in the capture and removal of the Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro. Many will make the argument that he was not a legitimate president, but that doesn't really carry any weight with the constitutional question. If you want to have a debate or a discussion or an argument as to whether or not it is necessary or justified to go in and take out Maduro, we could have that debate. And that's the reason why that debate should happen in Congress, so that we can have a consensus. And if you have a positive consensus to go take out Maduro, you have legitimacy in that strike. However the administration framed it, this involved U.S. military forces inside another sovereign nation directed at its sitting head of government. That is not routine diplomacy. And once again, there was no prior congressional vote authorizing such hostilities. Congress was briefed, and statements were issued, and arguments were made, but the operation came first. And then there was Nigeria. And the operations in Nigeria did not receive nearly as much attention as Iran or Venezuela. But the strikes conducted in Nigeria against terrorist elements were described as limited, targeted, and again, necessary. But constitutional structure does not expand or contract with objectives. The constitutional structure does not shift with the scale or size of the operations. The authority to initiate hostilities remains the same whether the strike is limited or large scale. And again, Congress was informed after force had been used. So what do these operations share? Iran, Venezuela, and Nigeria. Different theaters, different enemies, different jurisdictions, different justifications, but one consistent sequence. The execution of force and congressional debate came afterwards. The constitutional question is not whether any one of these operations was tactically effective or necessary. It is whether the decision to initiate hostilities should have been preceded by congressional authorization, as Article 1 assigns, rather than followed by congressional reaction. Because once force is used, the strategic and diplomatic consequences become immediate. Relationships change, escalation pathways open, political pressure builds. and Congress is no longer deciding whether the nation should enter conflict. It is reacting to the reality that has already taken place. That is the pattern shaping the current moment. Now let's step away from the branches of government for a second and step into public square. Because how a nation reacts to war often reveals as much as the war power itself. The Democratic response has been unified opposition with an inconvenient history. In the wake of these strikes under President Trump's administration, many Democratic leaders responded with sharp criticism. They invoked Article 1, they warned of escalation, they framed it as executive overreach. Those objectives are not frivolous, but consistency matters. During the Obama administration in 2011, Libya intervention proceeded without a formal declaration of war or specific authorization. Under the Biden administration, airstrikes in Syria in 2021 and 2022 likewise proceeded without congressional authorization. In those moments, constitutional alarm was quieter. If bypassing Congress is unconstitutional now, it was unconstitutional then. The Constitution did not change with the occupant of the Oval Office. Then you have Trump's most loyal supporters. They're in justification mode. On the other side, many Trump supporters defended the actions without hesitation. And the common themes are kind of as I mentioned before. He's protecting American interests. This is a deterrence, not a war. It was a limited strike. Bad actors don't deserve procedural delays. The Democrats did it, so why can't he? The War Powers Resolution allows him to act during the reporting period. Some argue that decisive action demonstrates strength and prevents larger conflict, that acting quickly deters adversaries and avoids drawn-out war. That argument is not new, and this is where the War Powers Resolution is often misunderstood. As we discussed extensively in episode 1, the resolution was not written to expand presidential authority. It was written to restrain it. Consultation, reporting, time limits, absent authorization. It was meant to slow unilateral escalation and not provide a runway for it. Then you have a third group of individuals in the public. The constitutionalists and the libertarians have a very structural position. And this is where I stand. Not in a reflexive opposition, not in a reflexive defense, but in a structural position. The war power belongs to Congress, and exceptions made for one president do not disappear when that president leaves office. They become precedent. If we tolerate executive first war power because we trust the current president, that same authority will be used by the next one, whether we trust him or not. Power expands far more easily than it contracts. So that principle must be consistent. If executive war making is unconstitutional under one president, it is unconstitutional under all presidents. So another angle that we need to look at is the congressional reaction. Public reaction is one thing, but congressional reaction is a whole nother thing. And here we see something even more revealing. Democratic criticisms of executive war powers argued that the president overstepped constitutional authority by acting without congressional authorization. Representative Jim Himes stated that his attention to this matter comes before the bombs fall and called the strike a violation of the Constitution's allocation of war powers to Congress. Briefings were demanded, legal justification was demanded, procedural was the argument. It was clear debate should precede escalation. But again, consistency matters. Under Obama and Biden, similar constitutional alarms were not sounded with equal intensity, and selective enforcement weakens structural arguments. What deserves some attention, though, and some respect, is that some Republicans broke rank. Senator Rand Paul supported efforts under the War Powers Framework to require a vote before sustained hostilities. Representative Thomas Massie stated plainly that offensive military action against another sovereign nation requires congressional authorization under the Constitution. They did not adjust their standard based on party. They applied the same constitutional rule under a president of their own party that they applied to prior administrations. That's what principle looks like. Then you have some mixed signals from the Republicans themselves. Some Republican figures criticized fellow members who raised constitutional objections, accusing them of undermining the president, weakening resolve, and giving political cover to opponents. There were calls for party unity, calls for discipline, calls for silence. At the same time, other members praised the strikes as strong, decisive, and fully within presidential authority. This tension exposes something deeper than policy disagreement. It is a question whether the loyalty to a president outweighs loyalty to constitutional sequence. Across these operations, the divide is not clearly partisan, but it is partisan for some. But it should be structural. Some members prioritize executive flexibility. Others insist that authorization must precede escalation. When military action precedes authorization, Congress is not exercising judgment. It is managing consequences. And that difference is the heart of constitutional design. What makes the current Iranian buildup distinct is that some members of Congress are attempting to assert their authority before force is used. Statements have been issued and war powers measures have been introduced. Funding leverage has been discussed. And this is not a reaction, it is an attempt to restore constitutional order before a threshold is crossed. One manages aftermath, and the other governs decision. Insisting that Congress authorizes hostilities before they begin is not isolationism. It is representation. It gives the American people, through Congress, a voice before blood and treasure is risked. Preemptive action is different. When members of Congress demand authorization before escalation, introduce war powers measures, or signal that funding will be restricted absent a vote, they are attempting to reclaim their constitutional role at the correct moment, before hostilities begin. And I want to be clear personally. I am personally tired of the pattern of endless war and open conflict. With that being said, I don't see a necessity in any of it. That's me personally. But I would be far less against conflict if it followed constitutional procedure. If Congress debated it, voted on it, and authorized it, then even if I disagree with the necessity of it, I could at least recognize and support the legitimacy of it. Because then the decision to risk blood and treasure would have passed through the people's representatives as it was intended to, not through one person. So before we turn to the War Powers Resolution, we need to take a step back and look directly at the Constitution, the source of our government powers. Strip away the headlines. What does the Constitution itself actually assign, and to whom? For those who want that deeper understanding, like I mentioned in episode 1, I really dove deep onto the War Powers Act and where the war powers were assigned in the Constitution. I went deep on the Federalist arguments, Madison's concerns, Hamilton's perspective, and early constitutional practice. For tonight's episode, we'll stay a little more disciplined and focused. What authority did Article 1 assign Congress and Article 2 assign the President, and why that separation was deliberate? And as we move into this segment, I genuinely like to hear from you. If something in this breakdown clarifies an issue for you or raises a question, put it in the comments. Thoughtful engagement and good faith challenges are welcome here. So let's go into Article 1. Article 1 establishes the Congress. Article 1, Section 8 grants Congress the power to declare war, raise and support armies, provide and maintain a navy, make rules for the regulation of land and naval forces, and ultimately controls the funding for the military. The key point is that the power to initiate and control war really comes down to Congress. Article 2 designates the President as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. Commander-in-Chief does not mean that they have the power to start a war at will. It means operational command once force has been authorized and the ability to repel sudden attacks. The founders separated this with purpose: the power to decide war with Congress, the people, the power to conduct war with the President, the executive. They did this to prevent unilateral executive war making. Debate first, authorization first, war second. And here are some of the quotes of our founding fathers on the issue. James Madison, in a letter to Thomas Jefferson on April 2nd, 1798. The Constitution supposes what the history of all governments demonstrate, that the executive is the branch of power most interested in war and most prone to it. It is accordingly, with studied care, vested the question of war in the legislature. He spells that out as plain as day as possible. With the executive branch of government, war is most commonly abused. So with careful investigation, study, and acknowledgement of history and trends, they put the power of war with Congress. George Mason, at the Constitutional Convention on August 17th, 1787, he says, I am for clogging rather than facilitating war, but for facilitating peace. So he is saying that he wants war to be difficult to start. He wants to promote peace. He does not want the country to be dragged into continuous war after war. Back in that time period, when you look at Europe, France was not even an entire country yet. When you look at the formation of France, it had happened only like a decade before the United States was formed. They still had many small states where France had conquered them all. You had the 100 Years' War only about a half a century before the United States declared its independence. You had constant wars within, at the time, the Holy Roman Empire. Many people see the Holy Roman Empire as one giant blob of a country. But in reality, it was hundreds of minor countries that were constantly fighting wars against each other for consolidation of power. And who initiated all of those wars? the executive of each kingdom, each fiefdom, each county, each duchy. The executive. So George Mason did not want to see that same continuation of war pattern in the United States. And with all of that careful study and deliberation during the Constitutional Convention, our founding fathers decided to put the power into the hands of Congress to prevent that. Now let's take a look at the actual language of the War Powers Resolution. In Section 1, it simply lays out the reason for the War Powers Act. In Section 2, it goes through process and policy. In Section 2, it states the following. It is the purpose of this joint resolution to fulfill the intent of the framers of the Constitution of the United States and ensure that the collective judgment of both the Congress and the President will apply to the introduction of United States armed forces into hostilities. It goes on to say, the constitutional powers of the President as Commander-in-Chief to introduce United States armed forces into hostilities are exercised only pursuant to 1. A declaration of war. 2. Specific statutory authorization. Or 3. A national emergency created by attack upon the United States. It lists 3 things. It does not list anything else. The breakdown is this. Right at the outset, Congress states its intent clearly. War decisions are meant to involve the collective judgment of Congress and the President, not unilateral executive action, except in cases of attack. It says bluntly that the President is to introduce U.S. armed forces only pursuant to a declaration of war, only pursuant to specific statutory authorization, and only to a national emergency created by an attack upon the United States. And here's the part that people start to quote all the time of the War Powers Act and take it completely out of context. In Section 3 and in Section 4 are where it speaks on consultation and on reporting. In Section 3, it says, the President in every possible instance shall consult with Congress before introducing United States armed forces into hostilities or into situations where immediate involvement in hostilities is clearly indicated by the circumstances. So that what that means is if there is a civil war going on in Sudan, we can't even send in peacekeeping forces without Congress authorizing it. Consult in every possible instance is very strong language. This is not optional. It is not merely notification after the fact. It anticipates discussion before escalation when circumstances allow. Section 4 is the reporting requirement. Here's where you get people talking about the 48 hours, 60 days, the 90 days, all of that. In the absence of a declaration of war, in any case in which U.S. armed forces are introduced into hostilities or into situations where immediate involvement of hostilities is clearly indicated, the President shall submit within 48 hours to the Speaker of the House and to the President pro tempore of the Senate a report. The report must include the circumstances necessitating the introduction of forces, the constitutional and legislative authority under which such introduction took place, the estimated scope and duration of the hostilities. What this means is if force If forces are introduced without prior authorization, Congress must be formally notified within 48 hours, and the President must identify the constitutional and statutory authority relied upon. But Section 2 makes boundaries clear. The President may introduce forces only pursuant to a declaration of war, statutory authorization, and national emergency created by an attack. Outside of a national emergency caused by attack upon the United States or its assets, unilateral initiation of hostilities, including even situations where conflict is clearly imminent, exceeds the framework of the statute lays out. And here's where the 60-day clock comes into play. The law then states within 60 calendar days after a report is submitted or is required to be submitted, the President shall terminate any use of U.S. armed forces unless the Congress has declared war or enacted a specific authorization or has extended by the law such 60-day period. There is also a provision for a 30-day extension if necessary for safe withdrawal. There is where the 90 days comes into play. It's a 30-day extension for safe withdrawal. This is the enforcement mechanism. Absent congressional authorization, hostilities must end within 60 days. It's not a blank check for 60 days of war. It's a deadline that must be renewed. So Section 5C, the statute further provides that Congress may direct the removal of forces by concurrent resolution. So this is not only giving Congress the power to initiate war, it's also giving the Congress power to end war. And if you have a president that can run away, attack other countries, you take that authority away from Congress, where it was designed by our founding fathers and where it rightfully belongs. The debate no longer becomes, should we go to war? The debate becomes, how do we stop it? So what the War Powers Resolution actually does? Well, many quote the War Powers reporting clauses as a blank check for a president to act. The War Powers Resolution does the exact opposite. It does not expand presidential authority. It attempts to enforce constitutional sequence: consultation, authorization, reporting, and withdrawal. Whether presidents have complied with it faithfully is a separate debate. But the text itself reinforces the same principles we've discussed all night. Hostilities require congressional authorization. Again, I'm only giving the basic understanding of the War Powers Resolution tonight. If you do want a deeper examination, the history as to why this legislation was written, passed, and how it aligns with Article 1 and Article 2, or the vision of the Founding Fathers, Episode 1 takes a real deep dive into this discussion. But with that being said, I don't have a lot of time tonight to keep going, so I'm going to wrap this up here. And I think this is a good place to land for tonight. We've covered a lot of ground, but at the end of the day, if we expect constitutional limits when the other side holds power, we must demand those same limits when our side is in power. The Constitution does not expand or contract based on who occupies the Oval Office. It either means what it says or it doesn't. All that is required is consistency in upholding the Constitution. The same standard, the same sequence, the same debate first, authorization first, and force second. And one thing that is important to remember: the last guard of the Constitution is not the president, it is not Congress, and it is not the judiciary. The last guard of the Constitution is an informed and engaged people. If Congress does not reclaim its authority, the War Powers Resolution becomes symbolic, and the Constitution becomes optional. But if the people insist on consistency, if we demand that our representatives honor the structure that they were sworn to defend, then the balance can be restored. So again, if this episode gave you something to think about, let us know in the comments. I genuinely want to hear your thoughts, your questions, and your challenges. And if you believe this kind of constitutional discussion matters, make sure to subscribe and share the episode so others can join the conversation. Thank you again